Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. Let's start. Reflection. She sat there, looking at her new orders. Finally, the ones she had been waiting for had come. She was going back there, back to him. She felt the excitement welling up inside her but wouldn't show it. After all this time, she would finally get to see him again. In the more than 10 years since the Winter War, as it was called by everyone, the war against Aizen that caused so many casualties, she could finally go back to the place where it had all began for her. Well, almost. Being assigned to the next town over wasn't that bad. She would be able to see Ichigo, Orihime, all her friends that she had been forced to leave behind after the war. She silently prayed that things hadn't changed too much since that time. Because of her original assignment being only temporary, coupled with the near death of the Sutaicho and the rebuilding that needed to be done in Soul Society, she had left to uphold her duties to them. She stood among her group of friends, the ones that had come to mean so much to her. She hugged Orihime tightly as the young woman sobbed into her arms, Uryu and Chad standing off to the side. Even Urahara, Tessai, Jinta, Ururu and Yoruichi had come to see her off. As she said her farewells to each in turn, she finally came to stand in front of Ichigo. She looked up into his eyes, not missing the sadness he couldn't hide. She wanted to say what she was feeling but couldn't. A lump had formed in her throat. She smiled weakly at him, wanting to do something completely out of character for her, but with her brother standing not far away, waiting for her to accompany him, she couldn't. She merely bowed low toward Ichigo. "Be well, Ichigo. Thank you for all that you have done for us," she said as she stood again, giving him that fake smile she gave to everyone who didn't know what she was. She walked back to her brother, nodding slightly as she moved past him, following Renji through the Senkai gate. With a last glance over her shoulder, she smiled a true smile at him as the gate closed. She sighed, looking up at the crisp blue sky, the clouds lazily floating by. She felt the excitement building up inside at the prospect of seeing him again. It has been so many years since peace had come to Saraiti. Several years since she had made her last visit to Karakura. Ichigo had been away at college, in the larger city of Tokyo. Ryu was there also, taking his pre-med classes. With his father being a doctor and hospital administrator, one would figure that he would follow in those footsteps. She smiled to herself. Ichigo, she said softly to herself. Always, he was the one to go against caution, against tradition, preferring to do things his own way. He did without thinking. He loved his friends and family blindly, never finding a fault with them, always rushing to protect them with his very life. Rukia looked over at her captain's hut. She knew he had to know she was leaving in the morning, as stated in the orders. She also knew that he would want to speak to her before she left, giving her any final instructions for her mission. Captain Yukitaki was a very understanding person and his advice was considerably invaluable to her. There was also her brother that she needed to see. Her assignment was set for the next 2 years. That struck her as a bit odd. Most of the Shinigami rotated out of Karakura and the surrounding areas in 6-month patrols. She was going for much longer. She couldn't help the nagging feeling that this might be a permanent assignment. She felt a flicker of hope at the thought. She stood and went to go talk with her captain before seeing her brother. She had packing to do. Rukia walked along the street, deep in thought, not paying attention to her surroundings. Her destination was the Senkaimon gate that would take her back to the world of the living. She could have used the private Kuchiki gate, but her captain had told her yesterday that they would be using the official gate since she was on assignment. "What's got you thinking?" she suddenly heard behind her. Startled out of her thoughts, she yelled out, "Ah!" Turning to find her oldest friend standing there, laughing, she glared at him for scaring her half out of her skin. "Renji," she snapped. "Don't sneak up on people." Looking abashed, Renji muttered out an apology. Falling in beside her, they walked in silence for a minute before he looked at her out of the corner of her eye. "So you gonna tell me?" he asked. "Tell you what? What you're thinking about?" "Nothing much really. Just thinking about my assignment." "Oh yeah, you're going back to the living world for a while, huh?" "Yes, 2 years. I don't know why it was set for so long. Most of the rotations have only been for 6 months in an effort to curb any ties with humans," she said. "Yeah, but you can't expect that wouldn't change some things after the whole Ichigo incidents in the past," he answered. "I know. I can't wait to see them all, though."
I've missed them a lot. Especially Ichigo. Rukia blushed slightly, ducking her head as she did. Renji, however, noticed. So I was right. I don't know what you're talking about, Renji. Of course I would be excited to see Ichigo. He was and still is, a very close friend of mine. Renji looked sad for a moment. You know, Rukia, 10 years is a long time. Many things can change. She looked at him curiously. I know that. I'm not going there to try to rekindle something that never happened, Baka. Putting his hands up defensively, he backed up a step. Okay, I get it. I'm just giving you a fair warning. I saw Ichigo a few years ago, remember? He's not exactly the same guy he was when you knew him, when he helped us here. Stopping, Rukia turned to him. What are you saying, Renji? Nothing. Just don't go there with expectations of anything. If you see him, tell him I said hi. Walking again, they came to the gate where her brother, Byakuya and Captain Yukitake were waiting for her. Bowing to her captain, she turned to her brother. Before she could bow to him, he placed a hand on her shoulder, effectively stopping her. Looking at him with a questioning look, he said, Renji and I will be by this Sunday to check on you and to make sure that you have all that you need. Smiling at him, she nodded her head quickly. Hi. Bowing to him and again to her captain, she began to walk through the gate where the Hell Butterfly was waiting to escort her. Turning at the entrance, she waved to them. Renji gave her a thumbs up while her brother watched solemnly. Captain Yukitake was smiling and waving back. Turning back to the tunnel, she took a deep breath and began following the butterfly. To you, Ichigo, Karen yelled as she kicked the ball to him. She, Yuzu and Ichigo were talking the afternoon off from housework, homework, schoolwork and anything else attached to the word work. Deciding to have a picnic, they had invited Urahara and his crew along. Yuzu had packed a lot of food, so there was plenty for everyone. Jinta, Ururu and Yoruichi were on the soccer field with them, along with Yuzu. Tessai and Urahara were sitting under a tree setting out the picnic blanket and unpacking all the food. Well, Tessai was unpacking all the food since they brought food with them as well. Among the two men was the little girl Relina, Ichigo's daughter. Urahara called her Rei but she answered to both names. The man was currently entertaining her by coloring with her on the many sheets of paper she had brought along with all her crayons. A little lion was also coloring with them. Yes, Khan was still a part of the group. With Ichigo's wife away at a medical conference with his father, Yuzu and Karen were staying with him to help him care for the baby between their college classes. After almost a week of non-stop working, Ichigo had been ready for a break. He knew how much his wife did around the house and also working on her research and taking care of the baby, but he didn't know that so much was involved. Thus, the impromptu day off from work. Ichigo took the ball that Karen kicked to him, steering around Jinta, running toward the goal. Suddenly, Yoruichi appeared in front of him, stealing the ball. Hey, he yelled after her, his outburst causing her to laugh at him over her shoulder as she began to move the ball to the other goal. He chased after her. Go daddy, go, he heard his daughter yell at him. Relina was almost 3 years old and absolutely adored her father. Her tiny fists were pumping in the air as she jumped up and down, cheering him on. He laughed and waved at her, causing her to squeal in delight before turning and hugging Tessai. The small distraction cost him. The ball struck him in the head, knocking him down. Pay attention, Ichigo, Yoruichi yelled at him as she raced over, smiling down at him when she stopped. He heard his daughter squeal again and then laughed at Yoruichi. Yeah, I really should, he said as he rolled over to get up. Time, he called out, jogging over to the picnic area. Relina ran to him, laughing and holding her arms up. He scooped her up as he ran by, playing growling into her belly, making her squeal and laugh all the more. He set her down, sitting on the ground as he reached into the cooler for a bottled water. Rei has been good, Daddy, she said as she sat on his crossed legs. Have you? I heard Tessai say that you ate all the cake, he answered. The look of outrage and shock on her little face as she suddenly looked over at the big man made everyone laugh. Relina looked back at her father, confused as to why everyone was laughing. I'm teasing, Rei, he said as he hugged her. Oh, she responded, leaning back against him. With everyone else coming over when he did, they all sat around. Relina was still sitting in Ichigo's lap, a serious look of contemplation on her face. The child loved to be the center of attention but not the cause for teasing. She didn't look convinced at her father's words. As everyone sat around, panting and resting their legs, Relina moved over to the cooler, reaching in and passing out cold drinks to everyone. Ichigo smiled at his daughter's actions, which reminded him of his wife. Sachi always made sure everyone had the items they needed when they needed it. Rei was like a miniature version of her mother. He looked around at everyone. Yuzu was sitting by Jinta, in between him and Karen, all three flushed from their play. "It's good to get out of the house. It's a beautiful day out," she said to no one in particular. Everyone agreed. Usually, on Sundays, Ichigo and his wife hosted a picnic or a brunch for everyone. Brunch was usually at their house, which was large but not a mansion by any means. Just large enough to accommodate their friends and family for get-togethers. Ichigo's wife insisted that he try to maintain his ties with everyone in his life, friends and family alike. She gave to everyone selflessly, never overbearing or demanding with Ichigo or his time. Ichigo sighed, looking over at Urahara, yoruichi hovering over him as he lay there sleeping on the grass. He wasn't about to guess what she was going to do. He pulled Rei back toward him, hugging her, inhaling her sweet scent that so closely resembled her mother's. He quietly counted his blessings while holding her. Ichigo suddenly got up from his position, Rei scrambling out of his way and crawling over to Urahara. Ichigo had felt something, it was familiar yet he couldn't quite put his finger on it. As Rei crawled over Urahara, her foot hit his groin, causing him to suddenly sit up as he cried out in pain, his head hitting the plate in yoruichi's hand. The work-cat had just stuck her fork in it and the jolt sent the cake flying off the plate, making a splat sound as it hit Tessai on the side of his face. Everyone stared as the cake began to slide off his cheek, landing with a plop in his lap. Suddenly, they all burst into laughter, everyone but Rei, who looked at Tessai as if he had done that on purpose but couldn't figure out why. Jumping up from where she was still situated on Urahara's lap, she reached over to the pile of napkins, putting them in his lap. "Here," she said before moving next to him, patting his arm gently. "You, her head tilted and eyes filled with concern. As Tessai began cleaning the mess, he smiled at Rei and said, "Yes, but you should probably ask Urahara Dono if he's okay." Rei looked confused for a moment, looking over at Urahara and seeing nothing wrong with him, though he was crying on yoruichi's shoulder. Regardless, she went over to the shopkeeper and began patting his leg, again asking in her small voice, "You, okay?" He looked up at her, smiling. "Hi, Ms. Kurosaki, I'm okay." Rei gave him her best smile before throwing her arms around him and hugging him. She gave him a small kiss on his cheek. "That better?" she asked. Urahara gently pat her on the back. "Yes, that's much better." "So, Ichigo, when does your wife come home?" yoruichi asked. Everyone turned to the man who stood there looking off into the distance. He didn't seem to hear her. "I can't wait for Dad to come home," Yuzu exclaimed. "He always bring presents. Probably something girly," Karen grumped. Hearing them, Ichigo smiled. They would be starting college next year. He sighed to himself. His sisters being away meant that his father would be spending more time at his house. He looked over at yoruichi. 3 more days. I pick her and Dad up on Friday. Miss her? Hell yes, I miss her, he admitted. He went back to looking off into the distance. Yoruichi suddenly looked in that direction as well. Seeing him shrug, she knew he probably hadn't figured out who it was. He sat back in his spot, pulling Rei back into his lap. Resting a bit more, Ururu tended the barbecue while Yuzu and Jinta talked quietly, Karen looking up at the clouds. Everyone seemed to be in a state of calm for the moment. Even Rei was starting to doze in her father's lap, her sippy cup dangling from her fingers. Ichigo pulled her closer to him, giving her a light squeeze. Yoruichi smiled to herself, her heart melting as she noted the tender expression on the face of the once gruff teen. Ichigo had changed a lot. His wife had caused much of that change, but his daughter had caused so much more. Ururu suddenly appeared by everyone, large platter of meats in her hands. "Anyo, food's done," she said quietly. Ichigo gently picked up his daughter, laying her on the blanket that was spread out for her. She snuggled into the small pillow, sighing softly in her sleep. Karen and Yuzu began to uncover the dishes that had been brought along as well. Tessai set out the plates as Ururu placed the platter in the middle. Barbecues weren't something they did a lot of but enjoyed as Ichigo's wife. Sachi had introduced everyone to her Western foods when she moved to Japan from North America. Everyone grabbed plates and plasticware as they began to dig in for the meal. They all laughed as they joked and ate, teasing and sharing old stories. Rukia wandered around the streets, staring at nothing as she gazed into the shops. She had been debating on the best way to see Ichigo. She had thought of going with Orihime, but when she got to her apartment, she wasn't home. She had also stopped by the Kurosaki clinic, but that too was closed for the day. The sign said that they would reopen that following Monday. She could feel Ichigo's spiritual pressure from a distance, but it was muted very well, not at all like she remembered. It was as if he had finally learned how to tamp it down or mask it. As she made her way slowly toward where she felt him, she could also sense Yoruichi, Urahara, Jinta, Tessai, Karen and someone else she didn't recognize but had a familiar feel. She soon found herself at the large park that they usually frequented when they were younger. She could see a group of people playing soccer, or at least, it looked like they were. As she got closer, she could see Yoruichi among them. The others, she could hardly recognize. Jinta was easy to recognize because of his hair. Ururu was also among them. She recognized Karen and Yuzu, Ichigo's sisters. Tessai looked to be refereeing the game. She saw the green cloth off to the side, resting under a tree. She smiled as she recognized Urahara Dono. She also saw a small bundle laying next to him. Looking back to the playing field, she saw him. Her heart skipped a beat, her breath hitched and she felt a warmth spread through her body. Suddenly, everyone on the field stopped and, in unison, turned to look in her direction. Seeing this, Rukia stopped, suddenly feeling very self-conscious, a blush starting to rise on her cheeks. Yoruichi was the first to reach her. "Oi, Rukia, long time," she greeted. Ichigo was right behind her, smiling down at the woman who still hadn't grown since the last time he saw her. She hadn't changed much in looks, though her hair was a bit longer. "Come for a visit, Rukia?" he asked. "Yoruichi Dono, Ichigo," she returned, bowing slightly to Yoruichi before giving Ichigo a smile. "I'm actually stationed in the next town over. Kagamino City. I don't take over until Monday, so I thought I would come early and see everyone." She looked expectantly at Ichigo, who smiled at her in return. Yoruichi suddenly felt an awkward silence rise up as she watched Rukia, who had a love-struck look in her eye. "Oh boy," she thought to herself. "Oi, Ichigo, wanna call it?" she asked, elbowing him to get his attention before throwing a thumb over her shoulder. "Yeah, we probably should. Ray is probably starting to wake up," he said as he looked toward the picnic area. "She'll need changed," he added as an afterthought. Smiling at Rukia over his shoulder, "Good to see you, Rukia," he said as he began jogging over to where Urahara was lay. Rukia felt a small stab of disappointment. He hadn't reacted at all like she had imagined. What happened? She thought to herself. She knew she didn't look that different from before. She looked confusedly at Yoruichi, who only smiled and shrugged in response to her unspoken question. "Come sit with us, Rukia. It's warm out and we have cold drinks. We have leftovers too if you're hungry," she invited, putting an arm around Rukia and guiding her to the picnic area where everyone else was. As they got closer, she saw Ichigo knelt down, busy with something while Urahara and Tessai looked away. She saw something small and white in his hand, bringing it to his mouth. She heard a playful growl followed by a squeal of laughter. She smiled as she wondered who he was babysitting. Seeing the small child jump up, Ichigo began to play with her, chasing her on his hands and knees, growling playfully into her stomach when he would catch her. She again wondered to herself whose baby that was. It was during one of those moments of squealing laughter that she realized what the little girl was screaming. Her blood went cold. The little girl stopped suddenly, turning to Ichigo before grabbing his face in her small hands. "Daddy funny," she laughed before throwing her tiny arms around his neck. Daddy. His daughter. Rukia said to herself. She could feel her smile begin to slip from her face as the realization set in. She watched silently as he picked up the child, tossing something in the nearby garbage bin and turned to Rukia. Ray, this is Rukia, he said to the little girl, motioning to Rukia. It was then that Rukia saw Ichigo's eyes staring at her from the little face, under a crown of reddish-brown curls that had been pulled into 2 pigtails. The little girl leaned against Ichigo, hiding her face for a moment before peering back at the newcomer. Thick, dark brown lashes framed those eyes that Rukia knew so well. She noted that the little girl didn't have Ichigo's hair color, but it matched her eyes, shimmering with gold and orange highlights that the sun played off of. Her skin was a creamy peach, giving her a cherub look. Your daughter, Ichigo? Rukia asked, reaching out a hand toward the little girl, smiling despite feeling as if her heart were breaking. She is beautiful, she whispered. Hearing that word, Ray looked toward her fully. Mommy boo full, she said. Ray cute. Ichigo laughed at his daughter's words. Yes, your mommy is beautiful and you're very much able, he said as he swung her up, growling playfully into her belly, making her laugh hysterically. Clearing her throat, Rukia regained some of her lost composure. Looking around, she grasped the first thing she saw. Yoruichi mentioned that there was food. Sure is. I need to make Ray a plate. She fell asleep before the food was done and just woke up, Ichigo answered, turning back to the others. Yoruichi was snuggled against Urahara, dozing while the rest were still kicking the ball around. Rukia smiled at how cozy everyone looked. She enjoyed the rest of the afternoon, watching Ichigo with his daughter, catching up on the news with everyone. She learned that Ryu and Orihime were going to be married. That one kind of shocked her. She always figured that Ichigo would end up with her. Chad spent his time between his ranch in Mexico that his grandfather left him and his home here in Japan. Most shocking of all was that Ichigo did not follow in his father's medical footsteps but rather had completed a business degree and helped with the financial side of his father's clinic, which his wife also worked at as a researcher, and she had patents on several medicines she had discovered. She learned that Ichigo met his wife in Mexico during a work-study program that both were involved in over a summer. Ichigo had stopped playing with his daughter long enough to pull out his wallet and showed her a picture of Sachi. Ichigo called her Saki. Seeing Ichigo's wife had made Rukia feel even more self-conscious about how she looked compared to the woman in the photo. As the sun began to set, everyone began to gather up their things, packing them up into their vehicles. Even little Ray had tried to help. Rukia laughed quietly as she watched the small child try to drag the cooler to the vehicle. Finally deciding that she couldn't budge it, she settled for something smaller. Urahara's gang also began to pack their stuff in their van, preparing to leave as well. Yuzu had picked up Ray and was buckling her into her car seat, Karen making sure everything was stored securely. Setting the cooler in the vehicle last, Ichigo turned to Urahara. Yoruichi, Urahara, he called as he trotted over to them. Thanks for coming out with us on such short notice. See you Sunday. Of course, Kurosaki-san. We wouldn't miss Sachi's cooking for anything in the world, he answered. Her foods are quite delicious. Rukia looked confused. Miss Kuchiki, our dear Ichigo here is married to the most amazing cook. You should come over Sunday as well and feast with us, he offered as explanation. She makes brunch on Sundays for us. Her idea from the start so that Ichigo doesn't lose touch with his friends or family. And since you're a friend, I'm sure you've got an open invitation. Yoruichi nodded in agreement. She is a great believer in family, she added. Rukia turned to Ichigo in surprise. Really? Ichigo smiled. Yeah, Saki lost her family a long time ago and has also been solitary, so when I came into her life, that all changed. She values friendship and wants me to maintain my relations with everyone. Chad, or you, Orihime, Tatsuki, everyone here and family especially. Renji shows up once in a while too, he added as an afterthought. Rukia visibly stiffened. Renji, he knows. Ichigo's smile faded. He never told you. She shook her head. No, he never mentioned any of this. That's weird. He was even at the wedding, Ichigo added. Yoruichi, seeing Rukia's face, interrupted the conversation. Rukia, How about you come with us? We can help you get readjusted, she said. Rukia let the older woman steer her to the van as Ichigo made his way to his own vehicle. Yuzu and Jinta were saying their goodbyes, Tessai keeping a fatherly eye on the boy. Hey, Yuzu, give him a kiss already and let's go, Ichigo called to his sister, making her blush. She did, though, giving Jinta a quick kiss on the lips before running to the car. She made it just as Ichigo was getting into the driver's seat. Rukia watched the car pull away, trying to hold in the tears that threatened to sting her eyes. Yoruichi watched from the corner of her eye, frowning slightly at the sadness she saw in Rukia's face. She turned to Kazuki, studying his profile a moment before looking ahead at the road before them, wondering suddenly if it was a portent of things to come. Chapter 2. Confrontation and Revelations. Ichigo lay on the couch, Rei sitting on the floor with Kan, both of them playing with her blocks and other toys scattered throughout the den. Ichigo was half watching a show on the History Channel about angels. Karen and Yuzu had taken themselves out to do a little grocery shopping for the curry that they wanted to make for dinner. Sachi was still unable to cook many foods in the traditional Japanese way and forget about using a chopstick. After 5 years in Japan, she still got hand cramps from trying to work them. Ichigo chuckled to himself as he remembered the first time she had come to dinner at his family's house shortly after moving here. She looked in every cupboard to try to find a fork. Ichigo showed her how to use the sticks, correcting her as she tried to eat. After many unsuccessful attempts, Ichigo had to feed her and himself. Yuzu thought it was sweet that Ichigo would do that for her. Karen merely ate her food in silence while their father was still seeing stars in his eyes. It had been everyone's first time to actually meet her as well. Sure, they had seen a picture, but it wasn't a very good one. Isshin had practically fallen over himself when he answered the door, unable to speak. When Yuzu had come to the door to see why her father was just standing there, she, too, fell silent. It was as they were both staring at Sachi that Ichigo had come down from his room, moving them aside so that she could come into the house. Sachi walked through the doorway, her hand in Ichigo's as he led her. She looked at Isshin, smiling beatifically at him for a moment before bowing as she had learned from all the research material on culture and tradition. Mr. Kurosaki, it is a pleasure to meet you, she said. Isshin continued to stare, making her feel uncomfortable suddenly. Her smile fading slightly, she turned to Yuzu and again introduced herself. When she was again met with silence, she turned to Ichigo, confused. I did this wrong? She asked. Ichigo smiled reassuringly to her. No, you were perfect, Saki. They're just stunned at the beautiful woman that walked through the door, he offered in explanation. Looking at both of them again, she smiled and then shook Isshin's hand before taking Yuzu's. The contact seemed to break their stupor as both suddenly blushed, laughing nervously. Welcome to my home, Isshin said in a loud voice, startling Sachi. It's great to finally meet you. Ichigo has said much about you. You're more beautiful than your picture. You and Ichigo will make beautiful grandbabies. Wow, Ichigo, you really found a keeper. You just moved to Japan, right? Quote. Yes, she replied, blushing at the remark about children. I did move here a few days ago. If it hadn't been for Ichigo, I would not have been able to find a place to live until my house is built. His smiling falling, Isshin asked, your house? The confused look again crossed her face. Turning to Ichigo, you didn't tell them. Ichigo laughed nervously, scratching the back of his head. It never came up. He offered weakly. Smiling in understanding, she turned back to Isshin. I was able to secure a plot of land where I can grow my herbs and do my research. My house will have a small lab attached to it. I can't do all my research at the school, so keeping it at home works well for me. Research? What kind of research? Ichigo interrupted. Why don't we sit down in the living room and discuss this instead of here at the doorway? Everyone had agreed, Isshin, Ichigo and Sachi sitting in the living room while Yuzu finished making dinner. She had gone all out to impress who she hoped would be her sister-in-law someday. Ichigo really needed to settle down, she had always thought to herself. At this point, Ichigo is around 20 years old. The winter war ended when he was about 16 by my estimation. After Rukia left and the failed relationship with Orihime, he needed someone in his life. Thus had begun the transition of Ichigo's then-girlfriend into the Kurosaki family. Her medical research fascinated his dad, and when Ichigo announced 6 months after that first meeting that he and Sachi were going to get married, everyone had been overly pleased. Ichigo sighed, making Rei and Kan look over at him. "Ichigo, she'll be on the morning flight," Kan said. "You have less than 24 hours before she comes home, and then you can stop sighing all the time." Ichigo looked over at Kan, Rei suddenly reaching over and pinching his cheek. Ichigo still wondered at how Saki had been able to get Urahara to make Kan his own body and at his specifications. He didn't look anything like the stuffed animal that he had used for a body. His hair was black, long and held in a ponytail at the back. His eyes were a brilliant blue with violet flecks. His face structure was similar to Ichigo's, but there, it stopped. He was as tall as Ichigo and well-toned, and ever gentle with Rei. Ichigo was, by no means, a negligent father. He loved his daughter more than life itself. But some days, she just wanted to be with Kan. "Mommy be home, tomorrow?" she asked. "Yes, Nei-chan will be home tomorrow," Kan answered. Satisfied with that answer, she went back to coloring on her blank pages. The knock at the door drew everyone's attention, especially Rei's. She squealed, running to the door, "Mommy's home." Ichigo went after her, catching her just as she tried opening the door. He picked her up, opening it himself. "Rukia, what a surprise," he said, stepping aside so that she could enter. "That's not Mommy," Rei said to Ichigo with a confused look on her tiny face. Kan appeared around the corner, stopping when he saw Rukia. His eyes widened. "Nei-chan," he exclaimed, suddenly making a dive for her. Seeing the impending disaster and Rukia's eyes widen in shock at the huge man suddenly flying toward her, Ichigo stepped in, grabbing onto Kan's face and shoving him to the ground. "Down, Bo," he said. "You're not the same stuffed animal you used to be. You could have hurt her." Thoroughly scolded and ashamed, Kan sat on the floor, head bowed. "Kan," Rukia whispered. Hearing his name and looking up, he tried to smile for Rukia. "Is that really you?" He nodded. Her eyes widened again, her mouth dropped open. Feeling something pushing against her jaw, she saw Ichigo's arm extended toward her, his fingers under her chin. "You'll catch flies," he teased. Rei laughed and made biting motions with her mouth as if she were catching flies. Blushing, Rukia smiled at Ichigo and Rei before turning back to Kan. She offered him her hand. "You shouldn't sit on the floor," she admonished. Taking her hand, though he didn't really need it, Kan stood up. "Can I give you a regular hug instead? I forgot about my body no longer being a stuffed animal for a moment." Rukia was startled again at the deepness of his voice, not at all like the voice she remembered. Things certainly had changed. By the look on Rukia's face, Kan could tell she was having an internal battle. Considering her feelings, he reached out, placing his hand on her shoulder and smiled, saying, "It's good to see you again, Rukia," and turned, walking back the way he had come. Turning back to Ichigo, she smiled lightly. "Come in, we'll get some tea going. We can catch up," he said, turning toward the kitchen, Rei still in his arms. As Rukia followed him, she had a chance to look at her surroundings. The house was large to begin with, and she had been slightly intimidated when she walked through the gate. Inside, the walls were made of the traditional rice paper and bamboo throughout most of it. The floors were a hard, polished cherry wood. What wasn't paper was painted a neutral color. The same cherry wood accented the moldings above where the walls met the ceiling. Her eyes widened as she stepped into the kitchen. The floors were covered in a patterned stone mosaic. The stone must have been flecked because it sparkled slightly. The walls a creamy beige, the appliances were all stainless steel. The counters all seemed to be of a rose granite. A large stove against one wall had 8 burners on it. This is where Ichigo was, his daughter still attached to him. She looked as if she were telling him how to boil the water as she gestured, and then would look to him to make sure he understood. Rukia watched as Ichigo smiled and nodded his head at her. He has changed so much, she thought to herself. As he got the kettle settled on the stove, he turned back to Rukia. "Sit." It's not like you're going to grow, you know, he teased, taking a seat himself at the bar, settling Ray in his lap. Rukia glared at him a moment before laughing. No, it's not like I'm going to. Hi, Daddy, the little girl asked, looking at him hopefully. Oh yeah, let me get it, he said as he set her on her own chair, going to the large refrigerator. He pulled out a plate that held the pie. Setting it on the counter, he turned to the cupboard, fetching plates, forks and a server. Ray looked at the pie before looking at Rukia, her eyes sparkling. Pie good, she exclaimed, the excitement on her face at the thought of pie made Rukia's heart melt. Rukia continued to watch the little girl as she patiently waited for her father to start serving. She watched as the first slice went to Rukia, smiling at their guest before squealing as Ichigo set a slice in front of her as well. Serving himself, he sat down for a moment before remembering something, returning with napkins. When he was settled on his seat, the water kettle began to sing, signaling that the water was done. Again, he jumped up to get the water and teacups. Returning again, he poured the tea, again serving Rukia first and then himself. Ray didn't seem to notice that she wasn't served. She was too busy trying to feed herself the pie that sat in front her. She's adorable, Ichigo, Rukia commented. Looking at his daughter, her face covered in cream and pie filling, Ichigo laughed. Yeah, and covered in bananas, he said as he made to wipe her face somewhat. Failing to get it fully cleaned off as Ray was trying to guide the fork to her mouth again, looking slightly annoyed as her father kept trying to clean her. Daddy, she exclaimed in annoyance. Fine, I'll clean you up afterward. Ray turned to him, a big smile on her face, clearly pleased that she had won that little battle. So what brings you by, Rukia? Ichigo asked as he turned to her, starting to eat as well. Taking a sip of tea, Rukia looked at him for a moment. Ichigo, she started and then stopped. Ichigo looked at her expectantly. I know you're married now, Ichigo, but I can't help but feel, she stopped again. Feel, Rukia poked at her slice of pie with her fork, buying herself some time. I care for you, Ichigo, she said in a small voice. Is that what you came over to tell me? He asked with surprise. I know you care for me. You're a good friend. Friends care for each other, baka. Rukia looked up suddenly, Ichigo's smile faltering for a moment as he saw the hurt in her eyes. Rukia, he could see her eyes begin to water slightly. Oh geez, he said, suddenly uncomfortable. Oh Rukia, I didn't know you had those feelings for me. Rukia cleared her throat, hoping her voice sounded steady. I did, Ichigo. With all that was going on, I never had the chance to tell you. Looking over at him, she continued. I know that I should have, and maybe things would have turned out differently. But seeing you now, I know I still have those feelings, but I'll have to get over. You have a wife now, she looked around. A beautiful home, a beautiful daughter, she has your eyes. Looking at Ray, her face softened. Ichigo sat there in silence, picking at his pie now. My only real question is, why? Why didn't you at least send me a letter, a message with Renji during one of his excursions here? Maybe I would have been able to understand better. I know that life goes on, but, she stopped herself. She was being unfair and she knew it. Rukia, he said softly. I had always thought that Renji had told you. Like I said, he was at the wedding. And what would I have said to in the letter? Hey, sorry I married someone and it wasn't you. It's not like we have a post-stop to Saraiti, you know. My life now and my life then, the life that changed my normal existence forever. They're worlds apart now. Yes, I'm married. I have my daughter. Please don't take this the wrong way. I love you, but this all coming out wrong. Rukia waited. I have to say this now, Rukia, and if it comes out wrong, I'm sorry. You know I was never good with words, he began again. I love you. I love what you did for me and I love how you changed my life. But I was never in love with you. Rukia sat stone still. After everything, after you left, I thought for a while that I was in love with Orihime. But over time, I saw that she was too clingy, too needy. I was being smothered by her. While she was something of what I wanted in a woman, she wasn't what I wanted. With you, you were always hitting me, correcting me, making me feel Feel like what? Ichigo sat in silence for a moment, looking over at his daughter, seeing her plate in her hands, licking at it. He smiled, then looked at Rukia, the smile gone. Like I wasn't good enough, he finished. Rukia was shocked. Not good enough, she thought to herself. You were, Ichigo. You were more than good enough, she answered. I guess I was more than a little forceful when it came to helping you. Smirking, Ichigo looked at her. That's an understatement, he said, taking a piece of the pie on his fork, eating it. Rukia continued to pick at her pie. All done, a little voice interrupted. Ichigo looked over at his daughter, Rukia doing the same. Both laughed as they saw that she had licked the plate clean, but her face was another story. Ichigo reached for a napkin, getting up and wetting it a little from the faucet. He cleaned up his daughter, removing all traces of the pie from her face and hair before taking her off the seat. Go color with Khan, okay, Daddy, Ray said as she took off running toward where she had left her toys. Rukia watched her go, grateful that the little girl had broken the uncomfortable tension that had been building up. She seems like a handful. Yeah, life would definitely be boring without her, he said. She'll be 3 in a few months. Time flies. Seems like just a few months ago, Sachi told me that she was having a baby. Now that baby is already running. Your wife, she must be an amazing woman to have caught someone as wild as I remember you being, Ichigo. Yeah, she is amazing. She cooks, she cleans, she researches, she grows things. Ichigo suddenly blushed as the last night she was home before her trip unexpectedly ran through his mind. Ichigo, snapping back toward Rukia, he smiled. It's nothing. I just remembered something is all. She is a great woman. You'll meet her on Sunday, right? You'll be coming over. Rukia nodded. Yes, but I may have company. If that's all right. Sure. The more, the merrier, as Sachi says. He suddenly grinned, an evil glint in his eye. Got a boyfriend already, huh? Rukia gave him an exasperated look. Tell me more about her. Sachi. Yeah, well, I told you I met her on my university trip to the United States, right? Rukia nodded. She was one of the assistants on the dig site. Teacher's aide. She was a little hard to get along with at first. She's something of a perfectionist, but not that bad. She's more firm than actually harsh. She's gentle but not. She got put in charge of the team I was on. She had to help me figure out how to put up the tent after you and Chad got all the parts mixed up. Ichigo laughed at the memory. She taught us a lot about the Navajo village that we had been allowed to research. It was an elective for me, but it was still interesting. After a few nights there, I discovered that they have hollows just like we do here. The place was a huge lure for a lot of them. It was higher in spiritual energy than in Karakura. That was also when I discovered that she was just like me. Rukia looked confused for a moment. Then it dawned on her. She's a Shinigami, she asked. Ichigo nodded, then shook his head. She is and she isn't. While she has all the powers of a Shinigami, she also has powers against demons, undead and other creatures. Her abilities surpass even my own. Rukia looked confused again. She didn't like being confused, but Ichigo was making no sense. If she's not a Shinigami, then what is she? Ichigo stared at her for a moment, debating with himself if he should tell Rukia about his angel or not. He didn't know how she would take it. He suddenly felt a presence in his mind, the feel of it soothing to him. He knew who it was. Rukia tilted her head, seeing Ichigo's eyes glaze over as he stared off at nothing. She waved a hand in front of him, receiving no response. Ichigo, what's wrong? What's got you upset? No, not upset, just trying to figure out how to tell Rukia about you. Rukia, the woman I told you about. The one who made me a Shinigami. Remember? Yes, I remember you mentioning her. If you feel you can trust her, then by all means, feel free. I told you that I won't keep secrets from your friends, and you shouldn't either. I know, I just don't know how she's going to react to it. Only way to find out is to tell her. Okay, now just to figure out how to word it. She seemed confused when I told her about your abilities. Use smaller words. The voice giggled in response. You're funny, brat. You're brat. Damn straight. Okay, I'll tell her. But I might not use all that small of words. He could sense his wife laughing at him, making him smile as he heard her musical laughter in his mind. Looking at Rukia suddenly, who looked perplexed, he took a deep breath. Okay, here goes, he started. Sachi she's an angel. Rukia's eyes widened. She stuttered. Yeah, I was confused at first, too, he said. But she is, of the order of the cherubim. And, wait. Rukia stopped him. Angels can't come down from the true heaven and live lives as mortals. That's insane. Do you realize what you're saying? Are you flipping out? Do I look like I'm flipping out? You just told me you're married to an angel. Not just a person, an angel. Not just any angel but an archangel. Ichigo pursed his lips, patiently waiting for Rukia to finish. Sachi is an archangel, Ichigo. There's no way that she can be here, married to you and having babies and doing who knows what else. How is that possible? Why is she here anyway? She ranted, suddenly stopping and looking him straight in the eye. Do you need help? Should I get a Sai, one of those people who handle crazy people? Ichigo sighed. Well, I guess that was expected. I know it sounds crazy, outrageous and like I'm lying, but I'm not. She's a guardian, she's an angel, and she's currently under punishment. She has been for a very long time. Even she's lost track of the time. She has to atone for something she did a very long time ago, and with me, she is doing that. Did she brainwash you, trick you? Rukia asked, concern written all over her face. What? No. She explained it all to me and I reacted the same way you are now. I didn't believe it until her brothers began showing up at random times. She can't take her true form, but they can. That's what convinced me. As far as me being with her, I knew what I was getting into. When I began to have feelings for her, she explained more in detail. I also had to be 100% sure that a life with her was what I wanted. That she was what I wanted. Rukia stopped pacing, staring at him in disbelief. It's not possible, she said in a whisper. Wait, didn't you say that she lost her family? Yeah, her mortal family. Her brothers are a different story, though. She sees them randomly. They're usually here when she needs them most, but other than that, she's not really allowed to spend time with them. Oh, Rukia sat back at the counter, taking a bite of her pie. That was a lot for her to take in at once. This pie is really good, she commented. Sachi made it, froze it before she left. Ray loves pie. Then Sunday should be a very tasty experience, Rukia quipped, smiling at him. She still didn't believe and didn't think she would. She would find out about this woman herself. Ichigo saw Rukia to the door after they finished talking. While he could still see the disappointment in her eyes, there wasn't anything he could do about it. He had chosen his path. He knew there were still some things that Sachi hadn't told him. He was willing to accept that. The life he had with her wasn't perfect, but it was pretty darn close. Ichigo walked into the den, smiling as he saw Khan sitting on the couch with Ray, a book between them. Ray was reading to him, or at least, giving her version of the story by the pictures. He took a seat in the recliner and picked up the book that was laying on the table next to it, finding his place and settling in to enjoy the book. Khan was just like a big brother to Ray. He had reacted unlike anything Ichigo had ever seen when he first met Sachi. Instead of diving toward her as he had done with so many women he had encountered before, he stood there in awe, his mouth open. He was intensely nervous around her. When she presented him with his own gigai that he could use for his new life, he had been overwhelmed and cried as they removed the pill from the stuffed animal and inserted it into the body. From that day on, Khan had been a devoted friend to Sachi. Khan had been there every day to help her through her pregnancy with Ray. They hadn't allowed him into the delivery room, but afterward, when she was born, they let him in to meet her. He had marveled at how tiny Ray was, spending hours intently studying her when they brought her home. With Sachi's help, he learned how to take care of her, hold her and comfort her. As with Ichigo, Khan's life changed as well. Sachi's patience with Khan had been as if she were a mother to him. She had taught him how to fight, manners, again, she had been firm but gentle with him as she had been when she was teaching Ichigo to master his Reiatsu and teaching him hand-to-hand combat techniques. She had guided both of them, made them stronger. She'd be home in the morning. Ichigo smiled to himself. He couldn't wait. Chapter 3. Another world. He did what? Jackson cringed inwardly as the should of the war chief echoed through his audience chamber. She cast a curious look to the tall human, dwarfed among the larger orcs and trolls. The human stood before Thrall. She stood tall, not showing any fear. She looked sad to Jackson, the same sadness she showed to the orc. I know it's hard to believe, Thrall. I don't know what's gotten into him, she said. But reports have come in that, while the purge was going on, he pursued a demon through the hordes of undead that began to rise up in Stratholme. The city still burns as we speak. The war chief looked in the woman's direction though not really seeing her. He was thinking. He knew that the high elves of Quel'Thalas were also having a time trying to find out what was causing the undead to begin showing up in their own forests. Reports had been coming in regarding contaminated grains. The dragons confirmed that something sinister was stirring in the paths of time they watched over. Jackson half listened to the conversation. She chanced a glance at her friend Sayanev, who stood there with a face as stoic as her own. Her husband, Tuvas, stooped beside her, stretching once in a while. Jackson smiled as she watched the very tall troll. He looked ready to yawn. Male trolls were so much taller than their female counterparts. She still marveled at the man who was able to capture her friend's wild heart. He was a master of the elements, like his wife, but he preferred not to actually hit anything with his fists. He preferred to let his magic do his fighting. The man was a formidable opponent in battle, highly skilled in tactics. He was a mage. Sayanev was a shaman. Her talents rested more in the spirits than the elements. Either way, both trolls were scary to fight against. Jackson sighed as quietly as she could to herself. She missed her sister. She hadn't seen her since before she was taken to another world. She didn't know what she was up to, what she was doing. Sachi had been taken from this world several years ago, when she was told that she wasn't an elf. She wasn't even from their planet. They found out that Sachi was an angel from a different world, a heavenly guardian placed here for her penance, born into this world as Jackson's older sister. She looked at the floor, smiling sadly as she let memories drift through her mind. Keep spacing out like that and you be missing some important information, Jackson. She turned, the deep voice of Tuvas speaking to her. She saw him grinning at her. Jackson shivered despite herself. Tuvas' tusks were very large and when he grinned, she could see his jagged teeth as well. Sayanev, holding onto his shoulder for support, her belly already starting to swell with the baby. As a warlock, she should not have been afraid of him, demons and the like being her specialty. Thought, as a high elf, she generally regarded most beings as beneath her notice, but Tuvas was much more than just another being. He was more powerful than she, he was above her. Sayanev giggled. Oi, Tuvas, you should not be scarin' the softy like that. Tuvas stretched, gaining his full height of 7 foot. Jackson had to crane her neck to keep eye contact with him. He slouched back down, now barely taller than his wife now, and she was tall herself at almost 6 feet. Jackson's slight 5-foot frame didn't even reach their shoulders. Sachi was even tall for a high elf, 7 inches taller than most who were around Jackson's height. Turning her bright green eyes to them, she smiled. I was just thinking of my sister. It would be helpful to have her here now. She was an excellent blood knight. Sayanev nodded. She was good, but I would not go so far as to call her superior, Tuvas added. She could easily lose focus at critical times. He cringed at the scathing look Jackson gave him. Now, little one. I am not saying the pally be bad. I just be pointing out the faults. Sayanev smacked him gently on the shoulder. Behave, Mon, she scolded. Jax, when was the last time you got to see your sister? Jackson averted her eyes, answering softly, before she left. I see. Maybe it'd be time for a visit. Sayanev looked at her husband. Tuvas can open the portal for you when you're ready. He nodded to his wife, turning away, Sayanev staying behind. Listen to me, Jax. I know you and your big sister be close. I've known you most me life and I know how close you two were, and this bine apart be killing ya deep inside, she said. You know that your sister had no control over what went down. She not be the one to blame for going away. But you do be having da choice of seeing her or not. Jackson looked at her childhood friend, tears starting to form in her eyes. Am I so transparent, Sia? Sayanev smiled sadly. As your childhood friend and heart's sister, I think this be a gift I acquired to read your heart so easily. She pulled Jackson close, giving her a slight hug. You go see Sachi. You get your heart better. Feeling the elf nod, she pulled away, Jackson looking about to see if anyone else had seen the private moment. Her eyes fell on the war chief, his eyes on her but again, not seeing her. Jackson looked up at Sia and said, in the morning, then. Jackson peered through her monocle, peering intently at the gem she was cutting. She had wanted to take a gift to her sister. After being apart for so long, she wanted to make something special for her. The necklace design she was working on was intricate, filled with gems in reds, greens, purples and blues. All were cut into teardrop shapes and set into the necklace. Each gem was tiny, the effect was that of flowers. Sachi had been an herbalist and alchemist when she was here. Jackson doubted that had changed about her sister. She set the last stone into the silvery titanium setting, gently hammering it into place. The titanium had been filigreed and patterned into vines and leaves. It was a beautiful piece and she was quite proud of it. Giving it a critical eye once again, she took it to her buffer, her foot stepping on the pedal that activated it. The few elves who had learned tinkering had made this device for her. She didn't know how it was powered but she loved it. Her gems sparkled more as did her other jewelry pieces. Looking over at her water clock, she knew she was going to be cutting it close to her meeting time with Sayanev and Tuvas. Taking the necklace over to the velvet box she had bought, she gently laid the necklace in it, admiring the way it sparkled against the deep blue velvet inside. Closing the box, she set it inside her satchel, slinging it over her shoulder as she made her way to the entrance. All homes within Silvermoon didn't have doors but rather, curtains. Her gems were stashed inside her safety deposit box at the bank as were her precious ores. Stepping out into the bright sunlight, she took a deep breath and let it out slowly, bracing herself for her meeting with her sister. Making her way to the sun spire where they were to meet, she smiled as she passed various other elves, emissaries from the Tauran village, orcs, trolls. War was brewing. She knew this. She was on the emissary council that had petitioned Thrall to help them with the scourge, who in turn took the issue to the other cities. Kil'jaeden had already destroyed the Sunwell. She knew her people's plight was well known throughout the lands. Looking ahead, she passed the Thieves' Guild, the sounds of their training barely reaching her ears. She suddenly grew nervous. She didn't know what this other world was like. She wondered if she would look different there. Did Sachi look the same? She couldn't back out now. Sayanev and Tuvas came into view, standing by the fountain that graced the city square. Sayanev waved, just in case she didn't see her. Jackson made her way over to them. As she got closer, she saw that Tuvas was holding 2 scroll tubes. She guessed he had a message to send to Sachi or Sia did. She didn't know what the other was. Oi, I made you a scroll of teleportation so when you're ready to come back, you just have to activate it, he said to her, holding out one of the tubes. Maybe they don't have a letter for Sachi, she thought to herself. She was wrong. Tuvas held out the second tube. This be for your sister. There's some things in there she needs to be knowing about what's going on here, he said. Sayanev stood to the side, letting her husband do the talking. She didn't know how long Jax was going to be gone and knowing already what was ahead of them in Azeroth, she may not see her again. Jackson thanked Tuvas, who nodded and then turned away to watch the warlock in training chase her demon around the square. He chuckled as he watched, shaking his head. Sayanev then spoke up, you be having a good time okay? Jackson swallowed, causing Sia to tilt her head in curiosity. You be okay? I don't know about this world she lives in. How does Tuvas know he's sending me to the right place? She said. He knows it be the right place because the location that your sister's brothers be telling him is to be within 100 yards, she answered. That be how the spell works. As long as he sees her, he be sending you near her. 100 yards, isn't that a bit far? Sayanev chuckled. Jaxi, just be looking for a place that looks like something your sister would live in, eh? Jackson laughed at her friend's reference to Sachiel's reputed flamboyance. She knew that her sister wasn't, She just liked to be comfortable, and unfortunately for most elves, that included extravagance. Jaxine, herself, lived in her sister's old home. One of the rooms had been converted into a jewelry studio so that she could make the pieces that were commissioned to her for various officers. "Oi, ya lazy rat, get over here," Sayanev called to her husband. Jaxine's eyes widened. It never failed to surprise her how the two interacted with each other. Tuvas came over, a smile on his face. "I not be lazy, I do things. Just cause you not be seeing 'em don't mean I don't do nothing," he teased back. Sayanev rolled her eyes. Yeah, she be ready to go. "Get wit. Da voodoo now." Tuvas nodded, silver light beginning to form between his hands. The slight hum of the magic he had focused there overriding the din of the commotion in the square. The portal appeared before him, giving a hazy glimpse into the world beyond. It didn't look like anything Jaxine had seen before. Looking at her two friends, she smiled nervously before stepping through. It was then that it happened. Tuvas was the first to notice, then his wife. A second figure ran through the portal, too quick to be identified, but both had a feeling they knew who it was. Before either could do anything, the portal collapsed. Everyone sat around the large rectangular table, talking, joking, laughing. Well, most everyone. Laid out before them was a banquet feast of various dishes, fruits, breads. Rukia listened to her friends talking, joining in now and again, her brother sitting stoically beside her. She had been surprised to see everyone. Chad, Ishida, Orihime, Tatsuki, Urahara and his bunch, Hitsugaya and Matsumoto. Just how many people knew about Ichigo's new life and didn't tell her? Meeting Ichigo's wife had really unnerved her. She was tall, coming just above Ichigo's shoulder. She was slender and well-toned, her skin giving a slight glow with its golden peach coloring. Rei had obviously inherited her mother's hair, which curled tightly down her back, most of it in a braid, the color a rich mahogany. Even her eyes seemed to glow with their vivid green coloring. Meeting Ichigo's wife had been the first time Rukia had seen her brother completely speechless. He had stammered out his greeting, actually blushing before moving quickly away. Ichigo had laughed and Sachi had giggled over his behavior. Now said brother was sitting there without moving much, as if afraid to draw attention to himself. Ichigo sat at the head of the table, his wife to his right. She served Ichigo and herself, and a plate was set for Rei as well. She kept an eye on his plate and on her daughters, making sure both were kept full, but she did not bother either of them. Ichigo joked with Renji and Chad. Ryu was being waited on by Orihime. Rangaku also helped herself to the various goods spread around the table while joking and talking. Hitsugaya was also enjoying himself, something Rukia rarely saw. The atmosphere was relaxed and friendly. "Kuchiki-san, are you alright?" Sachi asked Byakuya. "Is the food not to your liking? I know it's a bit different, but I did try to cook some of the more traditional foods." Byakuya looked at his hostess, nervousness apparent in his eyes. "The food is fine, I'm just..." Everyone had stopped to look at Byakuya, making him suddenly feel even more nervous. He cleared his throat as if to compose himself. "It's fine," he said again, going back to his plate where he began to eat again. Sachiel turned to her husband. Ichigo shrugged at her before turning back to Renji. "Ooh, so full," Rangaku said, patting her tummy. "I don't think I'll be up for training after this." There were agreements all around, but they knew that they would be allowed some resting time before the afternoon bouts began. Rukia looked at Matsumoto before looking at Sachiel and Ichigo. Seeing her unspoken question, Sachiel answered for Ichigo, who was still talking away to Renji. "We have friendly sparring matches after brunch and after we've given our meal time to settle," she explained. "We help each other with new techniques if we have one in mind, and also so that we don't get rusty or lazy." "Oh," Rukia answered, "so anyone can challenge anyone here?" She nodded. "Sachiel was kind enough to provide us with a training ground where we would be able to have multiple matches," Ishida added. "She was detrimental in helping a lot of us not only improve but control." He looked over at Ichigo, who still hadn't heard our abilities. Rukia looked again to the woman who sat near Ichigo. Her hand was in his as she listened to the conversation Ichigo was having with Renji. Looking back to Ishida, she asked, "Anyone can spar?" He nodded in answer before turning to Orihime, who was having a very animated conversation with Rangaku. Sleepy, mommy, Rei's small voice was heard over the noise. Turning to her daughter, Sachi scooped her up and cuddled her close. Mommy's sleepy too, baby. She stood, taking her for a nap. She leaned down to Ichigo, her hand on his shoulder to steady herself. That got his attention. She gave him a lingering kiss and he nodded in response to her unspoken message. Looking around, he said, well, Rei usually times her naps at the right time. Shall we all take our naps before we start the matches? Everyone nodded in agreement. While everyone seemed to know where to go for their naps, Rukia and Byakuya seemed a bit lost. Hey, Rukia, Renji said. Just follow us. Ichigo and Saki have an area set up for us all to nap. True to his word, Renji led them out to a large canopied garden. Set up were lounging chairs and couches, all overstuffed and looking extremely comfortable. They were set up around a small pond that had a waterfall leading to it. The canopy that was created by the large trees created a cool shade over the garden. Rukia looked around in wonder as she saw the flowers in bloom, vibrant color splashes against the green foliage. The gentle breeze that drifted through kept everything cool despite the heat outside, the waterfall's mist helping with that. Ichigo's dad said that he would be by later to train with us. He and the girls are busy reopening the clinic for business, Renji said. So you and Kuchiki Taicho can have 2 of the couches there. He pointed to a small grouping of chaise loungers that were piled with pillows. Looking unsure, Rukia and Byakuya made their way to the seats. You sleep out here. Renji looked over from his couch. Yeah. They don't have enough beds. Sachi thought that this would be a comfortable place for us to sleep. The sound of the waterfall is very soothing after a big meal like she cooks, he answered. Look at your brother, he looks comfortable. And indeed he did. Byakuya looked as if he were laid out on a funeral pyre. His hands were clutched together at his waist, his eyes closed. He had arranged the pillows to act as support for his head and back. Rukia could hear the faint sound of his even breathing, which signified that he was close to sleep. Taking her brother's example, she arranged her pillows as well, laying on her side before feeling the lure of sleep calling to her. Before long, like everyone else, she was sleeping. Thank you.